Hello, welcome to our Facebook live stream event. My name's Morgan. I'm going to be the presenter of this topic tonight, which is entitled Spiritual Nutrition. Throughout the talk, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, and my lovely assistant, Carolina, will do her best to answer them if we have time. So, or pass them on to me so I can answer them. So, the topic of this talk tonight is about nutrition, and what we aim to do is to present nutrition in the most holistic way possible. Now, normally a presentation about nutrition would focus on the kind of foods and the diet that would lead to an optimal state of health and support a natural state of well-being. But you see, whenever here we're already talking about well-being, this is implying that actually there is more to our being than just the physical body. And physical health is one thing, but actually if we look from a more holistic view, then we can't ignore this relationship between the different parts of our being, the body, the mind, the spirit. So hence the title of this talk, Spiritual Nutrition. And in this talk, we're going to take into account not just the physical body, but actually to look at man as a spiritual being which is integrated into something much greater than himself. Now, to do this, we're going to tap into some of the wisdom of the ancient yogic and tantric systems, because they are systems which are based around this idea that primarily man is a spiritual being, the body and the mind have emerged from the spirit, and so they also provide a very complex, a very detailed way of understanding the subtle structures of the human body, of the human being. They also provide us with some fundamental principles. We can think of them like universal laws. And these universal principles, they help us put into context the different aspects or the different perspectives that we could take, in this case, on nutrition. And they give us a kind of a solid foundation from which to base all of the many different perspectives and ideas that we can have about what it is that could be suiting this very complex structure of the human being in terms of the diet and what's best to nourish ourselves with. Now, in this talk, it's going to be two parts. So the first part, we're going to talk about this new perspective on nutrition. So a holistic perspective, if you like, or an integral perspective. When we talk about something that's holistic, this refers to the idea that the whole is made up of a sum of parts, and you can't just ignore one of those parts in order to make up the complete whole. So in this sense, the body, the mind, the spirit will be considered in finding out what is the best perspective we can take on nutrition. We can also consider it integral perspective. Not only this, but we are integrated, man is integrated into a much larger system, into the macrocosm, into the cosmos. So this will be the first part. The second part of the talk, we're going to look at this very fascinating idea of the relationship between diet and our level of consciousness, between what we eat and our level of awareness about ourselves and within the world. Now, this is something that is very often ignored. I've attended many talks, many debates, discussions, and participated in them even. And I've seen many different perspectives offered about what is perhaps the best and optimal diet for the human being. And I always found that people were coming from different perspectives, and this tended to cause some kind of confusion. It seemed that there could be something underlying that would provide a context from which to base all those perspectives on and would give them kind of more meaning. And this underlying idea or underlying principle can be discovered when we ask the following question. And that is, how does what we eat affect us as conscious beings? How does it affect consciousness? Our consciousness, the consciousness of that which we eat, the consciousness of those around us, and why not, the collective consciousness of our entire all the beings living on this planet. Now, many times this is just ignored, and you can imagine that the guy who's happy with his kind of fast food, even junk food kind of diet, who has no interest in spirituality, doesn't care whether it exists or not, doesn't think that that's has any importance for him. But little does he know that the very diet that he has keeps him in a certain level of awareness. And we could say, in this sense, it does affect his consciousness. So, in this sense, this looking at this link between diet and consciousness is going to offer us what we could say is a spectrum of diet, something where we go from kind of least awareness to more awareness. So this is what we're going to do in the second part of the talk. And before we go into that, just a little bit about myself, about my own personal experience. I've been experiencing with diet for around about 35 years now. When I was very young, I had an ongoing illness, and it was by turning to some pretty strict dietary changes that I was able to get out of that sickness. So when I was about 12 or 13, I started a wheat-free, yeast-free and dairy-free diet. Now, this radically transformed my health. It helped me get over the sickness that I was continuously experiencing. And that experience taught me two things. First of all, it gave me a direct experience, a proof, if you like, of how diet can affect not only how we are physically, but how we feel and how we think. So during that time of sickness, I felt, I couldn't say depressed, but I had a certain heaviness of how I felt, a kind of lethargy that was kind of ongoing, and I even had certain limiting kind of negative thoughts about myself. After that experience, those things were shifted, and I noticed very clearly the way I felt about myself and the way I thought about myself and the world changed. So that was a direct experience and a proof of how radical diet can transform us, both not just on a physical level, but also on an emotional and mental level. Now, the second thing that it taught me was that alternative systems work. The way I started this diet was by going to a naturopath. She used different techniques like iridology, looking into the eyes, and also taking homeopathic medicine. This was giving me some solutions that the standard advice from the GP and the traditional medicine couldn't give me. So these are the things that I learned from that. And since then, I've been following all sorts of dietary principles, ideas. I've taken a lot from the yogic and tantric system. There, they incorporate things like purification, the idea of toxic or toxifying or detoxifying the body, the idea of fasting, of all sorts of purification diets. I've introduced and explored different systems, things like the ancient healing system of India, Ayurveda, as well as from the Chinese system, macrobiotics, and explored these along with research from Western science and Western medicine on different aspects of nutrition and personal health. So it's a topic that's very dear to me, and very happy to share some of these insights with you tonight. So let's get into the first part of this talk then, which is about establishing a new perspective on nutrition. The modern materialistic model that we have of the world, it doesn't really support this expanded concept of the human being as a being with a body, emotions, a mental structure, a consciousness. And for this, we need to turn to some other models which can support that. Here, the yogic system, and particularly the tantric yogic system, are exceptional in that they describe in a very detailed way the nature of the human being and all of their subtle structures, their subtle bodies, and the very intimate connection of consciousness within the human being. So this new perspective on nutrition then needs to consider that we are can say, multi-dimensional beings. We exist in a macrocosm, in a greater environment, in a larger universe. We have a physical component, we have an emotional component, a mental component, and we can say a spiritual component, or that part of us which relates to our consciousness. So outlining then the specific aspects of spiritual nutrition would be one, not only that is good for our physical health, but taking it all the way, so also good for our emotional well-being. It can affect positively the way we think, but in some way can support our spiritual unfolding. And so this would be somehow the goal of what I'm trying to present here tonight, which is to find a way of eating and a way of relating to nutrition that supports our overall well-being and even our spiritual development. Now, this ultimate goal of eating in a way that would support our spiritual unfolding is a fascinating idea. We are evolving all the time, of course, and we could define in a certain way spiritual development in the most simplistic kind of way as a process of conscious evolution. Each of us, we go through our experiences. Hopefully, we learn something from those experiences. We can extract some information and we can develop ourselves. We can expand our awareness and develop more complete and complex understandings about ourselves and our place in the world. Well, spiritual evolution, in a sense, is just doing this consciously. It's intentionally making actions and making decisions that are going to lead us towards that place of evolving and expanding our awareness. So diet can play a role in this, and it does play a role in this. It's a very powerful discipline. It can help to not only to balance our bodies, to create harmony at our emotional and mental level, but it can also provide a way which can support this spiritual unfolding. So the goal then would be to create a new perspective on nutrition that will allow us to form a diet and to form different eating habits that would support and be aligned with our high state of awareness and to our appropriate function in the world. Now, in order to do this, we need a new perspective on nutrition. We could say we need a new paradigm. We need a new model of understanding what nutrition is. And what is it that we are being nourished by? Ultimately, what is it that is nourishing us? For this, we can turn to a principle that is described in the Vedic and yogic wisdom, the idea of prana. And you see, if physical food is the most dense form of nutrients that we can take in, what is it that is the most subtle? And in this sense, what would be the ultimate form of nutrition? So the idea of prana in the Indian wisdom is that prana is a universal energy, the universal principle of energy or force. It's the sum total of all the energy in the universe. It is energy, it's vitality, it's power, and it flows in everything. It's the foundation of and the essence of all life. It is the energy and the vitality that permeates the entire universe. And the prana, or this cosmic force, manifests at various levels of density. Ultimately, we can say this is what gives life and gives energy and gives force to the food that we eat and that we take into our body and that nourishes our system. So in this context, however, using this idea of prana, we can say that all levels of energy that are available to us can be considered nutrients. So not just the vitamin and minerals, the proteins and fats that we find in material food, but also subtle aspects. Everything from, not just from the animal or mineral or plant kingdom, but also from the subtle levels. Now, once we understand that these various levels or densities of prana are the main essential nutrient, then we can expand our perspective on nutrition. One of the key elements here is what we assimilate. So it's important not just what we eat, but actually what we assimilate into our body and actually into our body-mind system. And this is a very important point of forming this new nutritional paradigm. Now, a great example here is in the case of one of the famous vitamins that comes up, especially for those who follow vegetarian diets, was that of B12. Now, B12 was discovered that we are quite deficient in it, not just vegetarians, but also meat eaters, and because of the way our food is produced largely and the way we consume the food. And so quite years back, food manufacturers starting to put B12 in our food. Now, they picked a particular type of B12, one called cyanocobalamin, and it was discovered later that this wasn't the most easily absorbed into our system. And more than that, if we had too much of it, it could even inhibit the absorption of the more active type of B12. So it's important to understand how things are assimilated into our system. And it's not just a matter of very simplistically putting as many of the vitamins or minerals or nutrients that we believe are needed for our health into our system. We need to also know how it is that we can assimilate them. And that creates, of course, a whole complexity in the nutrition world, because certain elements will inhibit the absorption of other ones. Certain elements and nutrients work together with others to form a kind of synergy. And that's where we get an incredible kind of complexity in working out what is truly healthy for us or not. And you've seen this, those of you who follow the health circles, you can see that there are certain times where a type of nutrient is praised and other times it's not praised and it's considered not healthy. And there seems to be fluctuations in what's good for us or not. We get conflicting advice. And that is really because about this incredible complexity of the way the different forms of nutrients work in building a healthy system. So with this, we can come to a kind of foundation for a new perspective on nutrition. We can call it a holistic paradigm. And that holistic paradigm would be that nutrition is what we absorb into our overall body, mind, spirit system from the cosmic prana in all its different levels of density. So now let's take a look at the different types of prana, the different levels of density, and we can see how all of these could be considered nutrients. From the top, we can say the most pure universal form of this cosmic energy, prana, is what we could call undifferentiated prana, the pure pranic force. This would be something that we would assimilate only in meditation and in specific states of consciousness. So we could say this is the most refined, the most pure, the highest form of nutrient that is available in creation. At the next level of density are all of the subtle energies of the lower vibrations right down to the etheric level. Now, for this, the knowledge of the tantric system helps a lot because the tantric system there describes the whole creation exactly in this range of frequency from the most high, most subtle frequency right down to the lowest, most gross frequency. Now, within our being, we relate to all of those energies in different ways. We experience them as energetic sensations. We're experiencing them as emotions, as thoughts, as different kind of understandings, mental states, and so on. So all of these things can be considered a kind of a form of nutrients. You think about when we when we listen to a really beautiful piece of music, when you put on a good set of headphones and you put your favorite piece of music on and you just sit there and close your eyes, and it's like you savor the experience. It's like somehow you are nourished by that experience, because it is indeed, you are receiving some kind of information, some kind of energy into your system, and this is nourishing you in a certain way. In the same way, a good conversation can nourish us. When we have a conversation that's filled with really beautiful, sublime ideas, insightful concepts, it leaves us feeling fulfilled. It leaves us feeling nourished in a certain way. It's kind of enriching us, if you like. And this is a great contrast to the Facebook or social media platforms, which are, we can say, the kind of fast food of that kind of nutrition. They provide us with instant kind of information, but they lead us kind of unfulfilled. If you think about scrolling through the Facebook feeds, there's no point where you get fulfilled. It just keeps going on and on and on. And it's very different to when you experience a very beautiful, sublime movie, for example, where you go away from that experience feeling really enriched by it, really fulfilled by it. So all of these things we can consider as nutrients, and we can relate to them within this new perspective. So if we go down then to the next density of prana, we can consider sunlight. Sunlight can also be considered a form of nutrient. It's absorbed through the eyes, it's absorbed through the skin. The receptors in the eyes translate this full spectrum information through the optic nerve. It's conducted to various centers in the brain, particularly the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, and then through the entire endocrine system. Through these systems, it is indirectly energizing and activating our entire organism, and it's also regulating certain body cycles and rhythms, very important cycles that help us maintain health. The receptors in the skin also directly absorb sunlight. This radiant energy of light is transformed through our own metabolic process. We produce vitamin D and other hormones, and we know that this is an essential nutrient, vitamin D. And so this is produced by the sunlight being absorbed through the skin. Now, as our diet is refined, this form of energy becomes more important. So one of the ways that we can tap into this is to expose our body to the sun and to the light of the sun, and not just our skin, but also our eyes. There is even a practice, it's called sun gazing. This is a practice where people look into the sun at just in the sunrise or right on the sunset, and are very conscious, consciously aware of the light and the information that's being received through the eyes and into their body, and treating it like a kind of meal, if you like, standing there for a period of time and taking in the nutrients that the sunlight can offer. So we can genuinely consider the sunlight as a form of nutrients, and it's a very good advice to expose our body to the sunlight in a healthy way, of course. This production of vitamin D, by the way, is done in quite an intelligent way, because it is actually the case that with vitamin D, we can have an excessive amount. We can have too much of this vitamin in our body, and when we have too much, it becomes toxic. When we are in the sun, our body will generate this vitamin D until a certain point, and then it will shut off. So the actual process of producing vitamin D is self-regulating. And this is one of the, shows us one of the intelligent ways in which our body is in tune with these various forces of nature that are around us. So let's go to the next form of density of prana, going down the level, down the spectrum. And here we can speak about electromagnetic energy, energy coming from Earth's geomagnetic fields. This is absorbed into our body. There is a predominant frequency of the Earth. It's called the Schumann frequency. It's around 7.8 hertz. And this is something that is necessary for our well-being. They've done experiments where they've taken people, they've put them into an isolated environment where they've protected them from any magnetic or electric influence, and they've monitored various physiological conditions And they've seen that after a very short period of time, those people start to develop symptoms, things like headaches, uneasiness feeling, problems with sleeping, and various other physiological problems. They've then introduced a machine to produce frequency, which matches the Earth's predominant frequency, and very quickly these symptoms disappeared. So this shows that this frequency is something that is part of our well-being. It is something that we are taking into our system, and when we remove it or when we interfere with it, then this can cause great many problems. There is quite a lot of research done on this, by the way, and I really encourage you to do this research on the influence that EMF fields can have on our well-being. It's especially important now with the next wave of density of electromagnetic exposure comes out with the next release of the 5G network. And so I would advise you to study this and have a look at how EMFs actually affect our well-being and our health. So then we come down to the last level within the density of the cosmic prana, and that would be the energy that's contained in material food. That would be not only let's say the minerals and the vitamins and all the nutrients of the food, but also the life force that's contained within the food itself. Now, before we have a look at some of these notions with food, with this, and we see we can take into account some other concepts here. Now, here I'm going to introduce some ideas. These are just very brief introductions. To give us the idea that there is more to just nutrients that we bring into our body. For this, I'm going to mention a couple of notions that come from the Ayurvedic system of healing. This is perhaps the oldest holistic healing system. And Ayurveda is based on the belief that health and wellness depend on this delicate balance between the body, the mind, and the spirit. So you see, they already take into consideration the holistic approach. It's the whole being that's considering us as conscious beings. Now, this creates, Ayurveda is a very complex system, and it helps us maintain an awareness of nutrition as an interaction of both the forces that exist within the food and of the various dynamic forces that exist within us. The first concept from the Ayurvedic system that I'd like to present is called the gunas. The gunas is a Sanskrit word. Basically, this relates to universal tendencies or universal qualities. Now, the gunas relate to absolutely everything. Everything can be considered an interaction, an interplay of these three different qualities. Now, here we're specifically interested in the nature of these qualities and how that affects food. There are three of these universal tendencies. They are called sattva, rajas, and tamas in Sanskrit. And very simply, sattva, when we relate to food, refers to the pure, fresh, and whole food. Rajas would refer to the spicy, oily, pungent food. And tamas would refer to the processed, overcooked, stale food. Now, in nature, these elements or these tendencies, they would help us explain the kind of forces that exists within the food itself. So, for example, taking sattvic food. Hello. Sorry about that. Seems like we got disconnected for a few moments there. We're back and we'll take off where we left. I was speaking about these universal tendencies or qualities, which are known as gunas in Ayurveda. The way these would relate to the different qualities of the food, the sattvic type of food would be or would have a balancing effect on the body. The rajasic type of food would have a stimulating effect, and tamasic food would tend to have a kind of even a toxic effect upon the body. Now, we can also see how this type of food will have an effect on the mind. The sattvic kind of food would tend to turn the mind inwards and calm down the mind. The rajasic type of food would tend to turn the mind outwards and would agitate the mind. And the tamasic kind of food would tend to create kind of a lethargy or a heaviness in the mind. So now, these are very complex things, and as I said, I'm not going to go into them in that much detail, but why I wanted to present them was to show you that here is a system which, in a very elegant way, looks at the complex forces that exist within food, and even taking specifically into consideration how it affects both the body and our emotional mental level. Now, there is another aspect from Ayurveda, which I'll mention here, and that is this idea of the individual constitution. Now, this is a really fascinating idea that each person has their own individual makeup, their own, we could call it a biochemical individuality. In the Ayurvedic system, these individual constitutions are called doshas. They have the Sanskrit name Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And very generally, Vata would translate to meaning air, Pitta to fire or heat, and Kapha to phlegm. Now, we have a combination of all these three, and they govern all our biological and physiological aspects. When they're in balance, they maintain a healthy system and a healthy state of being. And when they become unbalanced, this leads to disharmony within our body-mind system. Now, this is a very interesting idea, because what this means is that what is suitable and even beneficial for one person might not be for another. This was something that comes to, let's say, help us understand this idea that it might not be possible to find the one perfect diet for every person. Now, before I came across these notions, I thought that this is quite a logical conclusion to come to, right? I mean, we're all of the same species, and it seems that we've all kind of evolved in the same way, so why wouldn't it be that there is one kind of diet that would be perfect for everyone? But that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. Now, a system like the dosha system in Ayurveda, which explains that there is an individual constitution, comes to say that each person interacts with food in a different way. So the food that is healthy for one is not necessarily going to be ideal for another. Just to give a brief example, if you're of a vata type person, then if you have very cold, and you'll have a tendency to feel cold and to be dry, and if you eat food that has this quality, this is going to make you feel imbalanced. Whereas for the pitta person who has a lot of fire and a lot of heat, these foods will be adequate and even may give them an increase in health. So this is a concept which describes this idea of the individual constitution. Now, one other concept I'd like to bring in, just again very briefly without going into too much detail, is something that comes from macrobiotics. Now here, we can say brings it down. This is macrobiotics, comes from the Chinese system, Chinese medicine, and here even simplifies it further to this basic interaction of the polarity of the yin and the yang, of the plus and the minus, of the active and passive, or heating and cooling aspect of food. There's a slide, hopefully you have up on your screen there now, which you can see just an example of some foods. And with macrobiotics, we can start to classify food and the force within food according to this yin or yang predominance. So we have certain types of food which are very yin, and when we eat those foods, when we consume them, they will have that kind of yin effect on us. Then they can range going all the way to foods which are considered very yang. The yang foods, when we eat them, will tend to have that effect on us. So the effect will be very similar to the quality in the yin or yang. So for yin, this can make us more receptive and more sensitive, whereas the yang type of foods can make us more active, more dynamic, with more self-control. So this is, once again, a very complex system, but here I wanted to just introduce it to put forward this idea that there is no perfect diet just for everyone. And if we really want to have a holistic and complete vision on nutrition, we need to consider both the dynamic forces that are within the human being and how they interact with the forces that are within the food and the nutrients that we take into our system. These kind of systems they provide us, such as Ayurveda and Macrobiotics, they provide us with wonderful models to understand this very complex interaction. So this is something that you can look into and explore. And then finally, we're going to come down to the lowest level, we can say, the nutrients in food. We find that cosmic prana condensed in its most dense form there. Now, in this aspect, we find 5 categories of nutrients: proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Now, in this section, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because this is something that you can quite easily find from a good book on nutrition or from doing a very simple nutrition course online. But I do want to make just some very general comments about these different categories of nutrients. First of all, with protein and fat, we find in there some essential nutrients. So with proteins, we know that they are made up of amino acids. There are about 20 or so amino acids. And some of them, around 8 of them, are considered essential. We can't manufacture those things in our body, and we have to get them through our diet. The other nutrients, the other amino acids, can actually be manufactured. Now, we need to consider this when we make dietary choices. There are some foods which contain all the essential amino acids, and when we eat those foods, then we could say that they are a complete protein. Now, it's the same with fats. With fats, we have some fats that we can synthesize in our body. We can actually manufacture them in our body. And we have some that we can't and that we have to get through our diet. These are called essential fatty acids. And you've probably heard of the omega-3 and omega-6. You see them plastered on all of the health foods that contain good fats, saying we contain good fats, because our bodies need them to be able to produce the different forms of fats, of fatty acids within our system. Now, one of the things to note about these essential fatty acids is there is a kind of an ideal ratio at which we can absorb them, or which we should take them into our system, and that ideal ratio will make it easier for us to manufacture these, they're called long-chain fatty acids. There are some plants, like many of the oils that we have are very high in omega-6, things like sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, a lot of the oils that are used very heavily in cooking and processing foods. Omega-3s are a bit more rare. They're found primarily in something like flaxseed or linseed oil. So unless they can also be found in small quantities in walnuts. And unless you're taking in that, you can actually get an imbalance. So this is something that you should consider, how you can keep a balance of these essential fatty acids. Chia seeds, by the way, are very high in omega-3s, and that's one of the reasons why they are considered such a health food, because they have a great source of omega-3 fatty acids. And so they can be used as one of the essential sources of those essential nutrients. So this is what I wanted to say very briefly about proteins and fats. With regards to carbohydrates, we know that in that there are various forms, from the complex forms such as grains and cereals that you find, right down to the simple forms such as sugars. The general rule when it comes to carbohydrates is to have the whole plant, like for example when we're taking complex carbohydrates from grains, parts of the grains, they actually contain nutrients, phytochemicals that actually have disease preventative properties. And when we start stripping away those nutrients, like we do when we make white flour, then you actually take away a lot of those disease preventative nutrients, and you're left just with the raw starch, which our body is then using for energy. They are predominantly one of our main energy sources. When we come to vitamins and minerals, once again, I'll just say something very general about these. Oh, by the way, before I move on, there was something I forgot to mention about fats. We have also heard of saturated fats, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated. We should take into consideration the kind of fats that we cook with, the kind of oils that we cook with. Saturated are generally the best. Monosaturated and then polysaturated. As we go down, the oils become toxic. And there is a form of fats which are called trans fatty acids. These are what are often labeled on foods as hydrogenated oils. This is when we take hydrogen gas, it's passed through a vegetable oil in order to make it solid at room temperature. Now, these are toxic. Trans fatty acids are toxic. Whenever you see this label hydrogenated oil, then you know that this is something that's toxic to the body. The research shows that eating these kind of trans fatty acids or hydrogenated oils can double the risk of heart attack. Now, heart attack is the biggest killer on this planet. It kills about 17 million people. 17 million people die of heart disease worldwide every year. So we should be much more concerned about trans fatty acids than dying from a virus, not to mention any names. Now, when we get to vitamins, once again, I will just make some very general comments here. One of them is to do with vitamin D. This is something that's not really readily found in plant foods in any large proportion anyway. And this is something that we need to absorb. Either we're absorbing it through the sunlight on the skin, as I mentioned before, or we need to take a supplement. In our climate, most of the year, for about 6 months of the year, the sun is too low in the horizon to produce vitamin D. So anywhere north of north of London, can say, and Northern Europe, they suffer this problem a lot, that through the winter months, there's not enough vitamin D, and one of the consequences is this seasonal affective disorder, and so one of the solutions is to take a vitamin D supplement. So this from about late March, so early April through to September, the sun is high enough in the sky and we can absorb vitamin D, so we can get it naturally. Through the winter months, it's very advisable to take a supplement. And there's one other vitamin that I want to mention quickly before moving on, and this is with vitamin B12. This is an important vitamin because pretty much every cell in our body uses this. It's more commonly used than was previously considered. And it's one of these things where a deficiency in B12 can cause many different types of symptoms and actually can be very difficult to determine. It used to be considered that B12 was something that only vegetarians or vegans faced, a deficiency in B12, because it is found in some meat sources, animal sources such as meat, eggs, and dairy. But there is also, as I mentioned earlier, a particular form of B12 that we should take. The most active form is called methylcobalamin. The ones that we find very often in food, like when you can buy milk with added B12, is a form called cyanocobalamin, and this is less bioavailable. So that's something for you to look out for if you do take a supplement for this. And by the way, regardless of diet, it's estimated that over 80% of the population has a B12 deficiency. So even if you are taking in eggs, dairy, and even consuming meat, there are other factors at play which has to do with the absorption of the B12. So this is something that is worth getting tested on and, if necessary, taking a supplement. So this was just very quickly some general comments I wanted to make about nutrients. As I said, I won't go into these in any more details, but if you do have any questions about what we've spoken so far, and if not, we will move on to discuss about the next topic. Okay, so you have one?
There is a question from Julie. She's asking, how do you find out which type you are, Vata, Pitta or Kapha?
That's a good question. You can do a very simple online test. I can't think of give you any direct links right now, but if you search online for Ayurvedic Constitution Test, and this will give you a series of questions, and you can answer those questions, and at the end it will give you a balance of your constitution of Vata, Pitta, Kapha. Now, one thing I should say, when we say balance, this is one of the misconceptions, is that it doesn't mean that they all should be even, that you should have 33.3% of Vata, Pitta and Kapha. You will have a natural balance of those, a natural distribution of those, and that will be your kind of natural constitution. And so balance for you means staying at that level of constitution. Yeah. So this is an easy way to do that.
Another question is if you can point out to some sources of B12.
It does exist in animal foods, in meat, in dairy, and in eggs. In the plant world, it's a bit less known. There apparently are some algae that do contain B12, but this is something that is a little, say, controversial. Some experts believe that the quantities are very small and they don't make any difference. But it would have been taken into our diet through contact with bacteria. It's actually produced through a bacteria. So probably traditionally we would have received it from the soil and received it through the food that we ate if we were eating very, fresh food from the garden, so to speak. But we, due to our very intense hygiene that we have with food, like cleaning it, peeling it, processing it, it tends to destroy any of that B12, and so we don't often get it through vegetable sources. Yep, so. Okay, so let's move on to this next section. In aiming to determine the optimum diet, one of the most meaningful questions we can ask then is, how does what we eat affect us as conscious beings? And this consideration of our consciousness it gives us a reference point that can help us put all other perspectives into place and somehow give meaning to them all, unite them all. To consider the quality and value of our diet based on how it affects us as conscious beings connects us, and we can say particularly or in additionally connected also to our environment, brings us to consider an evolutionary approach to diet and nutrition. And when we consider this, we can come with a spectrum of diet, one that ranges from least awareness to most awareness. Now, the advantage of taking this approach is it allows us to acknowledge the truth at every level of awareness. This is a good thing because often people with strong dietary opinions tend to get a bit judgmental, considering that their way of diet is the best. But this spectrum of diet sees that every kind of diet has its place. Every level has its own truth. And what's important is, and valid for each person, is so according to their level of awareness. So when we understand that, it can give us a much more broad perspective on the approach to nutrition and diet. So the spectrum of diet is one then that we can say moves from kind of a lower level of awareness to a higher level of awareness, and in this way leads us to a more integral understanding. We're going to consider three things in this. First of all, the diet type, the motivation factor, what motivates us to have that kind of diet, and the kind of worldview that would be related to that way of eating. The worldview is going to determine what's important for us and what's true for us at that particular level of awareness. So I'm going to bring up a couple of little slides now. The first one here shows the first type of diet that we'll look at, which we're going to say is junk food. Junk food is, we can say, that kind of food like candy, sweets, sweet desserts, fried food, sugary beverages, these kind of things. And there is a motivating factor for eating junk food, which is instant gratification. You want the instant gratification. You take that candy bar and you get the sugar hit and you get that instant gratification. Now, this tends to lead to a very egocentric kind of worldview. It's one where we can say that this instant gratification mentality will be kind of expanded into other areas of our life. Like, I'm sick, I want a pill so I can get ready straight away. I'm bored, I want instant entertainment. So it's kind of like this instant gratification gets brought into the other areas of our life. Now, this diet type is very much connected to the second level, which is fast food. The fast food is what we can consider kind of mass food, mass-produced food, food chains. The motivating factor for this dietary type would be convenience and efficiency. So this at this level, we've all taken some fast food or included it into our kind of diet. And very often we do it simply because it's convenient and because it's easy. And there is a value in that. We can say there is a value in efficiency in our diet. But when it predominates the kind of food that we eat, then it's going to leave us in this kind of limiting kind of perspective. The next level is what we call a standard Western diet. Now, the standard Western diet is something like meat and 2 veg. It's the very standard kind of food that we might have been brought up in. Probably many of us in the West have been brought up on this similar kind of diet: mashed potatoes, sausages, mashed peas, or whatever it is. It's usually a very limited range of food, often only 6 or 7 different vegetables, and quite often very heavy on the animal foods, meat and dairy. This kind of diet is very much defined by culture. the motivating factor there is social integration. We are motivated to have this kind of diet. Why? Because that's how we grew up. That's how we ate when we were kids. That's the kind of food that our parents served us, and that's the kind of food that our friends ate and our friends of our families had. So when we had that food, we felt that we were part of the society. Now, this is a very conventional kind of worldview. If we look across, we can say that the worldview that this leads to is a kind of sociocentric. So it's a little more expanded, but it's still very conventional. It's still very much about following society's conventions. Now, if we eat this kind of diet, then this is going to be reflected. This kind of attitude in life is going to be reflected into other areas of our life. So we'll tend to be the kind of person who follows society's conventions, who's not really questioning things. Why is it that I am eating this? Or why is it that this is forming part of my life? Or why is it that I engage in this kind of habitual behavior? And it will just tend to do it because that's what everyone else does, and if I do that, then I'll be accepted in society. So that's the kind of worldview, the kind of mentality, the kind of level of awareness that is maintained by this standard Western diet. Now, when we go on, we go to a whole foods diet. So a whole foods diet could be defined as one where we aim to eat food in its most unprocessed form. So instead of eating, white sliced bread, we would eat whole grain bread or wholemeal bread. Or even better, we'd probably bake it ourselves if we were into the whole foods diet. Instead of eating white rice, we'd eat whole grain rice or wholemeal rice. We would have very little processed food in our diet. So the things that we ate would be made very often by ourselves, fresh, made from fresh produce. And we would avoid a lot of the artificial things that are in food, things like artificial sweeteners, preservatives, flavors, and so on. So it would be one that's made up of whole food sources without any artificial additives. Now, the motivating factor here is nutrition. Here, we're no longer concerned just with what everyone else is doing and the kind of food that I brought up eating, but we're concerned with what is it that's most nutritious for me. So we'll start making dietary choices based on nutrition. It's usually at this level where we start to introduce a lot more variation into our diet. We'll introduce many different types of plants and foods into our diet. This also usually leads to a deeper connection with the earth. So it starts to awaken a kind of mentality where we consider where the food came from. We will probably start eating organic food because we're also concerned with what pesticides, herbicides and fungicides do, not just to the plants but to the earth. And to the nature. So we'll start to consider that when we make our dietary choices. This kind of whole foods diet means we could say it's a much more rational approach to diet. We'll start to make decisions based on common sense, not based on habit, not based on tradition, not just based on convenience, and not just based on our need for instant gratification. We'll make it generally based on what we consider is the healthiest kind of food. This is a very important level in the spectrum of diet. I'll come back to this in a moment, but let's continue. The next level of diet I have listed here is the vegetarian diet. Now, with a vegetarian diet, vegetarian means that we only eat plant food sources. So a pure vegetarian, it means that there are not only no animal flesh, but also no animal products. So that's what we would commonly know as vegan diet. So here, by vegetarian, I mean a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet, one which would include some animal products like eggs and dairy, but just not animal flesh. Now, what's the motivating factor here? Morals and ethics. Here, the morality of our diet comes into play. we're no longer content with the fact that something has to die so that we can merely satisfy some habitual needs or some tastes, some preferences. Our worldview also starts to expand when we adopt this kind of diet. It becomes more world-centric. It's a more complex kind of worldview. We start to consider not just our own, the effect that our diet has on our own health, but what it has on the environment, for example, what it has on society as a whole. We start to consider many aspects, so it's a more complex kind of worldview that we start to take on. It's also one which is much more, we can say, egalitarian, where one of the primary reasons is the equality of animals, seeing that they have an equal right to life that we do. We start to relate to things differently. Now you can see with the vegetarian diet how this can very easily change someone's perspective, their outlook on life. After years of not eating animals, we start to look at animals very differently. When you see that cute little lamb there in the field, you don't think of it as a food source, you think of it as a little, even a pet or a friend or a companion on this planet. So this is the next level, and then of course a natural evolution from that would be veganism. That's when we exclude any kind of animal products. So it's a pure vegetarian diet. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. The motivating factor behind this kind of diet is, once again, ethics and morals, but we could say to an extreme, and also purity, the idea of purification. This is quite a central kind of motivating factor behind veganism. Now, again, this is the worldview is once again more complete, and we could say it's a more holistic one and a more integral kind of worldview. Going forward then, we can go to the next level of evolution, which could be the raw food or live foods. So this is when the diet consists of only food in its raw form, so it's uncooked, it's unprocessed. Now, it's called live food because a lot of the nutrients are destroyed when we cook food. So the proponents of the raw food and live food kind of diet would say that this is the most pure kind of diet that we can have. And so the motivating factor there would be very much purification, purity. So this kind of diet is one where we create the least kind of toxic byproducts in our system. This is leading to a even more expanded worldview. We could say a cosmocentric. We start to look even beyond our place on this planet, and we start to see what is our place in the cosmos. How do we relate to all other living beings? We start to relate to life in a much more complex way. So even the life that plants have, we start to see that they also have a certain life force that comes through them, and we start to respect and honor that. So this is the raw foods, live foods dietary type. Now you can see I've left one more space there on that little chart. So I don't know if anyone can guess what might come next. What could possibly come next after raw live foods? Shout out to anyone who can guess that. Just put it in the comments. It's already there. Someone guessed it. So oh, really? Oh, I've just been told that the slide was already there, so it doesn't make much point that you were trying to guess it. So the diet type then is breatharian, or as it's called, inedia. So this is the case, the unusual situation when we get to a point where we don't actually take in any physical nutrients and we survive just on a pure absorption of prana, a pure absorption of that universal energy. Now, the motivating factor here would be a perfect assimilation of nutrients. With any other form of nutrients, there's a byproduct, there's a waste product. So at the level of inertia, we could say that we have reached a perfect level of assimilation of nutrients. And this would lead to a very broad worldview, we could say a spiritual worldview. So these are this is an outline of this spectrum of diet. Now, taking a look at some of these levels, first of all, one of the things that we should mention here is that to truly move from one level to another means that we need to integrate the previous levels. So then when you're ready, you can jump to the next level. So let's take, for example, the fast food diet type. When we go to the, even better example is the vegetarian dietary type. And this is probably one of the best examples because quite often people will want to make this jump to a vegetarian diet or, as is the case now with this modern trend, the vegan diet. Where someone makes a choice on some, perhaps it's an ethical decision, on adopting all of a sudden a vegan lifestyle, vegan diet. Now, if they haven't passed through the stage of the whole foods diet, then they are not going to be making choices that incorporates the truth at that level. What is the truth at that level? The nutritional value of the food. And there are many other things that I mentioned there about like having unprocessed food, having food in its most whole form as possible. And so what we end up having is, guess what? We have, if you go from a standard Western diet or even a fast food diet to a vegan diet, you have vegan fast food. You have someone who is vegan, yet they have a very unhealthy diet. And that's something I've seen time and time again, where people have made this step from the standard Western diet and all they've done to go to a vegetarian is just cut out eating meat. And they don't introduce anything more into their diet, they don't expand the diet, and they end up becoming unhealthy because they have not integrated and assimilated the truth at that previous level of awareness. Now, this whole vegan fad, by the way, at the moment, I'm in two minds about it because, first of all, I've been following a largely plant-based diet, predominantly vegan, for around 24 years. And when I've seen this movement taking place, I've been very happy because, of course, it's wonderful that more and more people go vegan. One thing I am concerned is that people are making a very big step and they're going from a very standard kind of diet with poor knowledge about nutrition straight to a vegan lifestyle. And what do we find about that? We find a lot of vegan fast food around. A lot of the vegan restaurants that are popping up are hamburgers and chips and vegan burgers and vegan sausage rolls and vegan hot dogs and things. Which I wouldn't say form exactly into the standard, into the whole foods category. Now, so this is something to consider. We can take in different levels of truth from each kind of dietary type. For example, the fast food is convenience and efficiency. Well, sometimes we need to go to that because we have to be efficient. We need to take on some kind of food. But we can make a choice that still integrates the whole foods level, the idea of nutrition, instead of reaching for that processed, rehydrated, potato crispy thing that's full of preservatives and sugars and artificial sweeteners and flavors. You can have a crisp which is a little more natural and which is chosen with the right oils and cooked a bit more naturally and so on, with the skin on, it's organic and these kind of things. So it's still of the fast food category, if you like, but it's integrating some of these elements that makes it a little bit healthier. So this is one of the concepts that I wanted to mentioned there. Now, in some cases, we may be required to do the jump automatically. One of the best examples of this would be a health crisis. When we have a health crisis, we may need to jump straight to one of the high levels, which would be taking into consideration the purification element. So we might need to go to a raw food diet, for example, which would give us the most degree of purification in our dietary choice. So this, very briefly, was the spectrum of diet. The question we can ask now, just to conclude this, is where are you on the spectrum of diet? And the advice is to do that level the best that you can, and realize that we need to assimilate the truth on each previous level before we move on to a higher level. The level there that I want to point out the most is the whole foods diet. This is one where I recommend people to look into this idea of being motivated primarily by nutrition, and then once we've done that, we can incorporate that into higher ideals like the vegetarian diet and the vegan diet, if we so wish to choose. So this is a little bit this connection between the type of diet that we have, the type of food that we eat, and our kind of worldview or our level of consciousness. Now, we can see that it goes easily one way. If we have a certain level of awareness, then we might make a choice, a dietary choice based on that. So if I have a certain moral standard or ethical opinion, then I don't want to take the life of an animal so that I can have some food. But it definitely goes the other way. And in the sense that the kind of food that we maintain will be reflected into our predominant way of seeing the world, the predominant kind of attitudes that we have in life, and ultimately can say our level of consciousness. In my experience, I've seen almost nothing as powerful as when someone takes the step into one of these higher kind of forms of diet, like a raw food diet, for example, for a period of time, and how it transforms the way they see themselves and the way they see the world. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to try and jump into a raw food diet, but the advice is to find out where you are, do that level the best you can, make sure you're integrating the truth of the previous level, and then consider the effect that what you eat has on your level of awareness and how it supports you in your overall development as a human being. Now, to end with, I would like to just go through some recommendations, and then if we have any questions at the end. Now, these recommendations are based on something that I was trying to find out, which was, from all these different perspectives, are there any recommendations that are agreed upon? Because there's a lot of disagreement within these different perspectives on diet. The person who adopts the raw food diet will have one opinion. The one who adopts the paleo diet will have another opinion, and so on. Now, I tried to find out some recommendations that would seem to be acceptable across the board, that people with, regardless of what kind of opinion or perspective they had on nutrition, would consider these to be of value. And that's the list that I have here. The first is to eat according to your biochemical individuality. That's this idea that we have individual forces that are working within us, that are interacting with the food that we eat, that makes it that some food for me, for one person, is different to food for another. And so we need to understand that. There is no one diet that's perfect for everyone. And we need to consider that when we make our dietary choices. By the way, there are other systems with this, like things like blood type, nutritional typing. There are various other models, but I gave the models there from the Ayurvedic system. The next recommendation is eat food in its most unprocessed form. So this means a form which is closest to its original form. So any processing is any kind of cooking or heating or taking apart, like when you extract certain nutrients from foods, when it's dehydrated and rehydrated. Now, all of these processes, not only do they reduce the nutrients that are in food, many of the nutrients in food are fat soluble and water soluble, for example. So when you cook things, it takes away those vitamins. But also it reduces the prana, reduces this life force that's contained within the food. That's very much connected to the next recommendation, which is eat food as fresh as possible. And the freshness of a food is very much connected to this life force, the prana that's contained within that food. So we should eat food as fresh as possible. The next recommendation there is to take a B12 supplement. It's shown in the research that I've done that the majority of people, even if they are consuming animal products, are deficient in B12. So this is something that's definitely worth getting tested. You can get a blood test done. The research that I've done shows that the best form of testing is actually a urine test, a urine sample. So your standard GP might not do this test. You might need to go to a nutritional expert to get this kind of test done. I really recommend to do this. Get your B12 levels tested, take a supplement. As I mentioned, there is an issue with the way we can assimilate B12, and so there are different forms of taking it, sublingually or even as little patches that you can put on the skin. So it's bypassing the digestive tract, and in this way can enter directly into the bloodstream. So these are some things to consider with this recommendation. That also goes with the vitamin D. Recommendation here is to check your vitamin D levels. That is something that can be done with a standard blood test at your GP. And take a supplement during the winter months. Now, vitamin D can be overdosed on, so you should follow the recommendations. I won't give you any recommendations on how much to take. That's something that you can look up through a professional health advisor. But there is one thing I would mention, that very often when we get the results of blood tests done, the healthy ranges, going from the lowest end of the range is basically, that's when below that you have health problems. So it's kind of like the low end is marginal in terms of being healthy. So very often the levels are much higher than those kind of standard health levels. Falling below those levels, you'll get sick. So very often you'll find that there are different interpretations of the kind of healthy ranges of different vitamins and nutrients that we have in our system. That's also something worth looking into. And that's particularly the case with vitamin D. Next aspect there, next recommendation is to include fermented foods. This seems to be one of the things that goes around across all perspectives. We find it present in many different cultures. Fermented foods have an extremely beneficial health benefits to us. They, particularly in terms of the benefits they offer to our gut microbiome. They provide a wonderful source of many nutrients. So look into the health benefits of fermented foods and bring them into your diet on a regular basis. The next recommendation there is to use superfoods. Superfoods are named because they have a particularly high nutrient content. Some of the common known ones are goji berries, maca, raw cacao, camu, these kind of things, bee pollen. These are something that, especially when we can't always have the perfect diet, when we have a lifestyle that maybe isn't, let's say, following all the recommendations that will keep us healthy, like having perfect night's sleep all the time and having a stress-free life and a pollutant-free life, then these foods are very useful to turn to give us that extra boost to our health and to our well-being. So the next recommendations are, and we go to the negatives now, avoid trans fats. I already mentioned how bad they are. They are toxic, and try to get rid of them and avoid them at all costs. Avoid artificial sweeteners. Artificial sweeteners have tremendous negative effects on the system. They can interact and interfere with our metabolic process, even damaging cell and DNA. So look into that. Artificial sweeteners are not as healthy as they're made out to be. There's even the situation where there's been no real evidence to show that they lower cases of obesity. And that's one of the things that they've been praised at as being a zero calorie to replace sugar. And even showing that there is not really any solid evidence to show that they don't lead to insulin resistance, which is what happens when we have too much refined sugar. So we want to avoid artificial sweeteners and avoid refined sugar. Next recommendation is moderate dairy intake. This will depend on your constitution as well. I'm of the opinion that dairy is really not something that's meant for the human being, but many systems do consider it a very valuable and nutrient food. So, but look into that. There is never the case where we have cultures that have excessive dairy consumption, especially this homogenized, pasteurized kind of dairy that we take in the Western diet. So either reduce it or eliminate it from your diet. And then avoiding refined carbohydrates is the last one there. I also want to mention, it's not on the list, but good water, a good source of water. If you're drinking tap water, reconsider that. Consider that tap water is very often loaded with pesticides and hormones and other sorts of impurities. So get hold of a good water filter and start drinking much cleaner water. So this is what I had to present. If you have any questions before we finish up, we have a few minutes left.
There's a question from Angelo Nell. He's asking if you can tell us what kind of food is good for flexibility and muscles growth.
Food
for flexibility and muscles growth.
Well, so in terms of muscle growth, proteins, obviously. If you are having a high demand on muscle growth, then you need to increase protein intake. Our actual daily requirements for protein are not that high, but when we do need, when we are doing a kind of strenuous exercise or workouts and we want to have a bigger muscle growth, then we just need to up our intake of amino acids for building proteins. In terms of other things with flexibility, well, that's one thing I would mention there. Some of the plants from the ginger family, such as turmeric, and these are often very helpful because they have anti-inflammatory properties. So you want to look for things that have anti-inflammatory properties. A lot of the food, when we have imbalances in our diet, causes a lot of inflammation, and this is we find that inflammation in the joints, and this is what can cause stiffness. So I would look into this, and a specific one I would mention there is turmeric.
San is asking, I understand raw diet and Vata constitution are in conflict. Is this still the case when we work on our digestive prana?
So, yeah, this question is about raw foods and the Vata constitution. The Vata constitution is one where we have a predominance of coolness or coldness and dryness. And very often with raw food, they tend to make us feel a little bit cold and to amplify this coldness. So from some perspectives, it can be seen that there is a bit of a conflict with this. On the other hand, I have seen some advocates of raw food who claim that even this kind of thing can be overcome by trying to balance that out in other ways. So by awakening the inner fire. You said digestive prana. I don't know. I'm not sure if you meant digestive fire in that. If you're talking about digestive fire, then yes, that is one way to counteract that. You would need to awaken this element, this fire element in your being much more. So the digestive fire, the dynamism, needing to be more dynamic, and also taking care of anything else that might conflict with the vata aggravation. So I followed raw food for quite a while, and I have quite a predominance of vata in my system, and I found this also to be a problem. But I also found that by adding very small amounts of cooked food, or even just warming the raw food up to, you can heat food up to around 40 degrees before you start killing the enzymes. And so having warm food was helping to resolve this kind of issue.
Siri is asking, what kind of filter should we look at to purify the water? Filter.
Oh, okay. So with the water filter, so first of all, you can just start out with your standard carbon filter, the kind of thing, the desktop or benchtop filter, like your Brita filter. They are actually quite good. So if you're on a budget and you want to just get something quick, go down to the supermarket. You can't do that now. You have to do it online. Get a Brita filter and you can get started right away. The next level of filter is when you do multi-stage filtration, when you want to it uses carbon as well as ceramic. Ceramic has a very small pores, so it can start to eliminate a lot of other impurities from the water. So you'll start combining ceramic with carbon filtration. And then going further than that, you can start to add other minerals which can further the filtration and even bring some minerals back into the water. If you really want to go extreme, you've got reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is where it pushes the water through a membrane that's so small that practically only the water molecules can make it through. Now, this is one of the only ways that we can remove things like calcium carbonate from the water. That's quite difficult to remove at lime scale, which we have a big problem of in this country. So these are your kind of filtration options. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up now. So thanks for joining us, and just want to mention that here at Tara Yoga Centre, we are a charity, and we love to offer all of these talks and webinars free for as many people to attend. If you feel like being generous, we would love to receive some donations so that we can keep doing these live and free events. You can give a donation by going to our website, or I believe that Carolina will now put a link in the comments. And finally, I just want to say thank you for joining us, and I wish you the best of health. I wish you wonderful insights and personal growth through these fascinating and interesting times. Thank you.